Hello, hello. This is Middle Child, and I am John Edward Willie. And today I'm using a new kind of microphone, and so I'm really just praying that it's working and capturing my voice fairly accurately, enough to convey some content, perhaps. I'm less interested in the quality of these recordings and more interested in simply getting them out there and simply getting attuned to using my voice as a medium, as an instrument. And so I'm hoping that if the content can come through, I can build from that. But anyways, I hate when people make recordings and discuss things that are irrelevant to the recording itself, except that my recordings are irrelevant themselves. And so I'm sort of just talking just to talk, except that in the back of my mind, there are always various elements at play. And I say that to speak in reference to whatever formal procedure I have. I seem to wake up in astonishment. I'm always reading and then writing. And if not writing, then recording. And if writing, then more recording. And sometimes when I record, it inspires me to return to reading or writing. But I sort of live in a relationship with those endeavors. And what I do here comes out almost like a kind of surplus. It makes you wonder what philosophy is. And on a certain sense, you could say that the majority of mental content is itself a surplus of an underlying activity that is purely instrumental. And so what we think is a lot of times sort of like waves on a sea. It's the surface waves. And to confuse those waves for the ocean is to confuse the mind for reality itself. And so much of what's going on whenever we think or say anything, it's oftentimes an indication of another kind of complexity that we are missing. And yet so much of our thinking at the same time places a huge emphasis on that hidden surplus. And um, I hope here to instead accumulate material as I grow, less like an ocean that's waving and more like a river that's flowing. And so if thinking itself is you know, as William James, the American philosopher, once said, it's a stream of consciousness. And of course, obviously, no one does that better, at least in the original way, than the writer Virginia Woolf, who is sort of one of the first writers to reflect the natural, spontaneous currents of our underlying thinking, at least in a modern sense. And so I think that some of what I'm doing when I make these recordings is that I'm hoping to infuse what I am with the sense that I want to reflect the natural currents of the mind, of thinking itself. And so if there is a theme in this little recording, it has to do with the rushing water, the currents of thought, and the fact that we can pretend to have control over our minds. And in many ways we do. I don't think that can be denied, that there's an extraordinary power in our capacity to understand the world and to change the world. There's also an extraordinary capacity that we have to miss the obvious. And so there's a sense in which thinking itself is a double-edged sword. And so at the same time that we slice open the world, we can easily slice open ourselves in unhealthy ways, unmeaningful ways. We can undo meaning just as quickly as we make it. One of the strange features of being linguistically conscious creatures. And so, again, to hint or to intimate or to say directly the theme, as I am wont to do, I am struck by the chaos of thinking. And I'm only struck by it because it corresponds so hugely in contrast with how we like to think about ourselves as being self-contained, self-explicable, self-referential creatures. And I know that sounds crazy if you're not familiar with these thoughts, or it may be that it's just not music to you in the sense that these kind of thoughts have no meaning. But if you're interested in the nature of truth, or if you're interested in questions about who you are, or questions about what meaning is, or where meaning in life might come from, then these questions are very helpful. And the thing about philosophical questions that I think is interesting is that in many ways you're just making it more difficult. You're making it more difficult for yourself as a means of making it more real, as a means of questing for that truth, the truth as an ideal, not as anything that anyone has or can have, but the truth as an ideal in the sense that one is continuing to push further into what it is that we really are. And so what's interesting is that you're taking the hard path. So rather than taking the easy path of assuming, rather than taking the easy path of identifying with immediate signs in your environment, or immediately assuming that your problems have been resolved when they have not been resolved, or that they've been dealt with when they've not been dealt with, or creating problems in the opposite way, insofar as you're sort of thinking that something is real when in fact it's a construct of your imagination. These are all things that the philosophical path tends to unstabilize, destabilize. And I mean that it's natural in us to take shortcuts because language itself is a kind of shortcut. And so that's why I mean to hint or bring up again what I meant earlier, which is that, philosophy is a double-edged sword, because at the same time that it allows for a kind of broad view of things, as um, another philosopher said, the map is not the territory. And so although the map is very helpful, to confuse it for the thing itself is to miss not only the point or the reality, but the very adventure of life is found in and seeing the relationship between these two. And in many ways, I'm saying too much, but at the same time, not saying enough. And I guess that's the difficulty in some of what we do in philosophy, because at the same time that you're philosophizing, you're always performing ad hoc. You're always performing extemporaneously. And that's why I think that in philosophy, it's not a science. And a lot of people understand that it's not science, but they still don't understand what it is, because philosophy has a lot in common with mediums like arts, in the sense that it doesn't work with any empirical program, or it doesn't work with any methodological um, rigor, insofar as we don't have any way of testing the speculative or testing the philosophical. And in many ways, what I need to say is that when you speak, you're not speaking according to a set of logical premises and principles, and you're not, unless you're following a deductive train of thought, you're not really doing anything at all, except that you might be becoming more clear about the nature of thinking, or you might be becoming more clear about the specifics or the whole itself. But when we philosophize, so much of what we're doing is a kind of discourse that is socially oriented, but at the same time, it's a very private affair. And so you spend time thinking within yourself, almost like you're practicing an instrument. But the point of philosophizing isn't to read the books themselves or to think, but to participate in a back and forth with others, to have a fruitful conversation. And in many ways, that's what I mean by philosophy mirroring arts, insofar as it mirrors something about music. It's something like a back and forth. And so, if you're going to use a word in academia, you might as well reuse it or reappropriate it. And the word that is to be reused is is the term dialectical, dialectic, which is an old word in philosophy that means many things, but ultimately it means the kind of reciprocal relationship that master musicians have. And so there's a discipline and a freedom in philosophy. And so if there are elements of that, it has to do with the play on these two parts. And these two parts sort of go back and forth because they sort of depend on one another. And in many ways, that's where the the sense of there being meaning is found in the surprise, and the surprise is found in the other that one is discoursing with, and it has to do with the the emphasis on perspectivism, the emphasis on the shifting relations of perspective, and the ways in which thinking, when it's sustained in this way, produces a kind of meaning that isn't like meaningless in itself, but as I referenced earlier, as a kind of surplus. And so, to use another word besides dialectical from academia, there's the word heuristics. So there's something inherently heuristic about philosophical thinking, and that's a word that I get from Richard Feynman, the American physicist, pretty famous, but he writes about the nature of heuristics in multiple books and speaks about it. And it has to do with what is in fact the inherent nature of thinking, which is that it's playful. It's not a science, and maybe it's not an art, but it's playful insofar as it's using the imagination as a way of constructing things that aren't real. And the point of constructing that is to see what might happen, to see what might occur. Because if there are fundamental things in philosophy, it has to do with that play between freedom and spontaneity, or discipline, I mean, and spontaneity. And so what it has in common also with music is that you are, on a certain level, mastering certain elements. It's not that these elements are written in stone, but that these elements are rooted in the patterns of that dialectical back and forth. And so if you're going to have a shared, meaningful conversation, then both sides have to be attuned to those underlying fundamentals. And just like Miles Davis with Coltrane, there's an incredible nuance, spontaneity, and rhythmic play and discovery within their work. And all of that has to do with a sort of mastery of the forms. And that's just one representation of what takes on manifold forms. In every discipline, hence the word discipline, you're doing something that allows you then to forget the form itself and begin playing. And that play is not a meaningless, superficial activity. It is meaning in itself, if that makes sense. And so what I'm attempting to do in making this recording is to draw water, because that's all that I can do, is to draw the water, to reflect the water. I can understand the water insofar as I can understand its chemical makeup, or perhaps I can understand the emergence of water in the biological world out of the physical state of a planet, of a universe, and so work backwards. And yet, what is that in comparison to jumping in water in the most literal sense and swimming? There's something else that's required, and it has to do with the mastery of a physical movement that isn't conceptual, but is, as they say, phenomenological. And so, what I'm doing, even when I speak, is drawing water in the multiple metaphorical use of that phrase. Because to draw water means not only to draw it figuratively, to represent that complexity of waves that we cannot master because it is chaos in itself, but it's also to draw water in the sense that it's a figurative use of the phrase drawing water. It also means to pull water from the ground, as if you have a well. And if you're digging a well, because you're digging deep, you're also accumulating within that well this reservoir. And that's the reservoir that I'm drawing from, because at the same time that I'm drawing the complexity of thoughts as they emerge, I'm also drawing upon the reservoir within. And I don't know what that reservoir is because I am it. And it's a reservoir of meaning and memory. It's a reservoir of association. It's a reservoir of learned tools. It's a reservoir of relations that are so organic that we can't explain them except insofar as we become them. And I suppose I should say something about the complexity of my own thought because I've been recording these recordings for a long time, and it's only now that I'm starting to put them online. And so I'm sort of hyper attentive to the fact that there's a tendency in my language to become very complicated. And you would think that I would apologize for that, but apologize I cannot, because I'm also thinking and writing sort of in defense of the intellectual life that is the life of the mind. And it sounds pompous, and it sounds like you're trying to be something you're not. But these are all cliches. And rather than being truths, rather than it being true that I'm simply someone who's trying to sound smart, or rather than it being true that there's no meaning to talking this way, so why not get on with life? I think there's great meaning to be found in that. And I know it's hollow to say so, but I think that, to follow Shakespeare, mark my words, because my body's going to make good upon the earth the words that I speak. And what I mean to say is that in this relationship between words and life, between the order and logic that language attempts to impose on the world or to discover in the world, there is a world that is itself always taking apart, always undoing, always deconstructing. And so there's a certain sense in which you don't have to deconstruct your own thoughts. You don't have to be philosophical. Because as it was said by someone else, that life will make philosophers of us all sooner or later. There's a sense in which the underlying questions will begin to occur, given that the catastrophes of life inevitably occur. And so in that existential reality, it's inevitable that you'll begin asking yourself questions. And it could be that it's after you've had a few drinks. It could be after a car accident. It could be after a divorce. It could be after graduating from school or some great achievement. It could be on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon that you begin asking yourself questions. Questions that go beyond the immediate questions of how can I satisfy myself, or how can I get what I want, or how can I make others happy. There are questions that to others, to most, are ludicrous and ridiculous, but these are questions that ultimately in many ways determine the very experience that we have of the world. And so rather than saying that philosophizing or speaking in complicated ways is ridiculous, or rather than apologizing for it, or rather than saying that I'm going to be ridiculous, I go to the far extreme and say that one should be serious about life. And it doesn't mean sustaining a kind of seriousness that is morbid or draconian. And it doesn't mean that one isn't able to play and be free. And it doesn't mean that one doesn't have leisure or that one isn't living. In fact, living is the point. I think that within us, there's what Tolstoy had called the kingdom. The kingdom is within. And I don't think religious people have a monopoly on this interior space. I don't think that most scientists even agree with how science is represented as if it were a unified field, as portraying what we ultimately are, as being animals, as being biological creatures, as being beings who ultimately have nothing inside. I work against that as well. So in the many ways, what you do when you philosophize is you might be, on a certain level, arguing against like religion, But on another level, you'll find yourself arguing against science. And you'll sort of find that in the middle of all this is you, the middle child, forever in the middle, forever being reborn. And it doesn't mean that you're not striving to find integrity and to create space within, or to find a meaningful way of living, but that you're not giving in to the most ridiculous thing of all, and that is the belief that you have certainty, because as soon as you recognize the lack of certainty with a capital C, and then you also recognize that we have to make choices and that we have to work with the world, you find that you're in a curious position, where your enemy in many ways is certainty, but on another level, it is self-satisfaction. And so it's against my own self-satisfaction that I think and I record and I write. And it's against my own self-satisfaction that I continue to push forth this impossibly ludicrous activity, which you can call thinking, call philosophy, which to me is inseparable from life, from the difficulty and the beauty and grace of life. And those two go together. And so I think that rather than explain what I am and what I'm doing, I'm hoping that my voice alone can represent it, if not be it. Thank you. This is Middle Child, and I am signing off.